Imagine the frozen hell of December 1944, where the fate of Europe hangs on a razor's edge, and the legendary George Patton meets an immovable object in the Ardennes. As Dwight Eisenhower watches the maps turn red and Omar Bradley's confidence shatters, the relief of Bastogne becomes a nightmare of burning steel and shattered hopes. This is the moment the American dream of a swift victory died in the Belgian snow. The winter of 1944 did not merely bring cold, but a paralyzing, soul-crushing frost that turned the Ardennes forest into a graveyard of giants even before the first shells screamed through the misty air. General Dwight Eisenhower sat within the hushed, tense atmosphere of his headquarters, staring at the jagged lines of the Allied front while the weight of a continent's liberation pressed down upon his shoulders. He knew that the German gamble, spearheaded by the fanatical energy of a regime facing its final days, was not a mere raid, but a full-scale decapitation strike intended to shatter the alliance between Washington and London. Across the line, the German 6th Panzer Army and the 5th Panzer Army moved like silent predators under the cover of a thick, impenetrable fog that grounded the legendary Allied air superiority. This atmospheric shroud acted as a shield for the King Tigers and Panthers that prowled the icy roads, their engines roaring with a predatory hunger for American blood. In the center of the storm stood the small, unassuming Belgian town of Bastogne, a vital crossroads where 7 key roads converged like the spokes of a wheel that Hitler desperately needed to turn toward the sea. Inside the perimeter of that doomed town, the men of the 101st Airborne Division huddled in shallow, frozen foxholes, their summer uniforms offering no protection against the biting winds. General Anthony McAuliffe held the line with a grim defiance, but even his legendary courage could not conjure the ammunition, food, or medical supplies his men so desperately lacked. The German ring had snapped shut around them with the cold precision of a steel trap, leaving the screaming eagles isolated and bleeding in the white silence of the forest. Just like that, the crisis reached its boiling point in a heated briefing room where George Patton, the flamboyant and aggressive commander of the Third Army, made a promise that seemed to defy the laws of physics and military logic. He looked Eisenhower in the eye and declared that he would turn his entire army 90 degrees and launch a counterstrike within 3 days to save the trapped garrison. This was the ego of a man who believed himself a reincarnation of ancient warriors, a leader who viewed the battlefield as a stage for his own personal glory. But history is a cruel mistress, and in this darker timeline, the hubris of Patton collided with a tactical reality that no amount of ivory-handled revolvers could overcome. As the 4th Armored Division began its frantic drive northward, the weather did not break. Instead, it intensified into a blizzard of biblical proportions that turned the narrow Belgian lanes into chutes of fire and death. The German defenders, specifically the elite 5th Panzer Army, had anticipated Patton's move and reinforced the southern shoulder of the Bulge with a density of anti-tank guns and veteran infantry that turned the landscape into an impenetrable wall. Suddenly, the lead Sherman tanks of Patton's relief column hit a wall of fire near the village of Martelange, where hidden 88mm guns tore through their thin armor like paper. Instead of the lightning-fast breakthrough Patton had envisioned, his divisions found themselves bogged down in a grueling war of attrition that bled his strength white before he could even see the spires of Bastogne. The roads became choked with the burning husks of American steel, and the screams of wounded tankers were muffled by the relentless falling snow. Immediately, the psychological toll began to weigh on the high command as news filtered back to Eisenhower that Patton was not moving. He was dying in the snow. The silence from Bastogne grew longer and more ominous as the German artillery began a systematic pulverization of the town's defenses, turning every cellar and farmhouse into a tomb. Patton paced his mobile headquarters like a caged tiger, his face etched with a rare and terrifying expression of despair as he realized his miracle was evaporating in the mist. The German commander, Hasso von Manteuffel, sensed the hesitation and redoubled his efforts, throwing his Panzerlehr division into a final catastrophic assault on the southern perimeter of Bastogne. Without the hope of Patton's arrival, the American paratroopers began to feel the icy grip of reality as their last shells were spent and their bayonets became their only defense against the looming steel monsters. The contrast between the burning heat of the Tiger tanks' muzzles and the frozen, gray limbs of the American infantry created a visceral scene of absolute carnage. Just like that, the strategic initiative shifted back to the Reich, as the failure of the Third Army to reach Bastogne meant that the German spearheads could continue their drive toward the Meuse River. Eisenhower faced a choice that would define his legacy: continue to throw Patton's broken divisions into the meat grinder, or accept that the 101st Airborne was lost and prepare a new defensive line that would sacrifice thousands of his best men. The tension between the American generals and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery reached a fever pitch, as the British commander began to openly suggest that the American command had collapsed under the pressure. But the soldiers on the ground did not care for the politics of generals. They only knew the cold and the sound of approaching treads. In the woods around Bastogne, the Screaming Eagles engaged in a series of desperate, close-quarters battles where the rules of war evaporated in a flurry of grenades and knives. The forest floor was no longer white. It was stained a deep, dark crimson as the American paratroopers fought for every yard of frozen earth, knowing that no one was coming to save them. Patton's failure echoed through the halls of Washington, where the casualty list began to mount, and the public's belief in an easy victory was replaced by a grim realization of the war's true cost. The 4th Armored Division, once the pride of the Third Army, was reduced to a collection of shattered remnants huddled in the snow, their spirit broken by the realization that they had failed their brothers in the town. This was not a tactical setback, it was a psychological catastrophe that threatened to unravel the entire Western Front. Immediately, the German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, seized upon the image of Patton's stalled tanks to proclaim a new miracle of the House of Brandenburg. They broadcasted images of captured American equipment and dejected prisoners to the world, striking fear into the hearts of the occupied populations of Europe. The what-if of Patton's failure was no longer a theory, as the shadow of the swastika seemed to lengthen once more over the continent. Eisenhower, his face a mask of weary determination, finally ordered the retreat of the remaining elements of the Third Army to more defensible positions, effectively signing the death warrant for those still trapped inside the Bastogne pocket. The decision was a tactical necessity, but a moral weight that would haunt him for the rest of his life, as he had to prioritize the survival of the front over the lives of his most elite division. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and the heavy, oppressive silence of a defeat that no one had thought possible. Just like that, the German panzers broke through the final thin line of the 101st, and the crossroads of Bastogne fell into the hands of the Wehrmacht. The strategic hub was lost, and with it, the chance to quickly end the war in the West, as the Germans now possessed a secure base from which to launch further strikes into the heart of the Allied line. The victory that had seemed so certain in the summer of 1944 was now a distant memory, replaced by the grim reality of a war that would drag on through another bloody year. The fall of Bastogne was the cause, and the consequence was a total restructuring of the Allied strategy that saw Montgomery given more power and the American generals relegated to a secondary role. Patton, the man who would be king, found himself sidelined and silenced, his reputation as an invincible commander shattered by the icy winds of the Ardennes. The war had changed, and as the snow continued to fall over the ruins of Bastogne, the world waited in terror to see what would happen next in this darker version of history. With the fall of the Bastogne crossroads, the strategic architecture of the Western Front did not just crack, it underwent a violent tectonic shift that threatened to swallow the liberation of Europe whole. Immediately, the reverberations of Patton's failure reached the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, where the air was no longer thick with the confidence of impending victory, but with the suffocating stench of a political and military crisis. Dwight Eisenhower stood before his maps, watching the red ink of the German advance bleed deeper into the blue lines of the Allied positions, realizing that the miracle he had gambled on, George Patton's legendary speed, had been buried under the relentless Belgian snow. Just like that, the prestige of the American High Command was held hostage by the very man they had tried to sideline, as Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery prepared to step into the vacuum of leadership created by the disaster in the Ardennes. The consequence of this failure was a brutal purge of the spirit, as the reality of the 101st Airborne's annihilation began to sink into the collective consciousness of the American soldier. While the world had expected a story of rescue, they were instead handed a narrative of abandonment, as thousands of the Army's most elite paratroopers were marched into the heart of the Reich as captives or left as frozen sentinels in the ruins of Bastogne. This catastrophic loss forced Omar Bradley into a state of near catatonic shock, his 12-line command structure fracturing as divisions were peeled away to plug gaps that should never have existed. The German 5th Panzer Army, bolstered by the capture of massive American fuel and ammunition dumps, suddenly possessed the logistical oxygen to breathe life back into a dying offensive, turning the Bulge from a temporary salient into a permanent jagged wound in the Allied side. Suddenly, the friction between the Allies ignited into a firestorm of accusations, as Montgomery launched his infamous press conference not as a victor, but as a savior picking up the pieces of an American collapse. He spoke with a clinical, detached arrogance that sliced through the pride of the American generals like a bayonet, implying that only British methodical planning could prevent the Germans from reaching the Meuse and beyond. Eisenhower, caught between the fury of his American subordinates and the undeniable reality of his own strategic miscalculation, found himself issuing an ultimatum to London that was essentially a desperate plea for unity in the face of a total command breakdown. The alliance was no longer a partnership of equals. It was a fractured house struggling to stay upright while the German wolf howled at the door. But while the generals bickered in heated rooms, the German high command sensed the shifting tides and unleashed Operation Nordwind with a ferocity that caught the Americans in the South completely off guard. Heinrich Himmler, fueled by the intoxicating news from Bastogne, threw his fresh divisions into the Alsace region, aiming to capitalize on the vacuum left by Patton's failed northward drive. The city of Strasbourg, a symbol of French liberation, was suddenly in the crosshairs of a rejuvenated Wehrmacht, forcing a political crisis between Eisenhower and Charles de Gaulle that threatened to pull French forces out of the Allied command entirely. The war was no longer about advancing toward Berlin. It was a desperate, panicked scramble to hold onto the territory already won at such a high price in blood. Immediately, the psychological center of gravity shifted to the east, where Joseph Stalin watched the Western disaster with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator who knows his rival is wounded. The Soviet Union, seeing the Americans bogged down and defeated in the Ardennes, accelerated their own winter offensive, the Vistula-Oder operation, with the intent of reaching the Oder River before the West could even reorganize. The race for Berlin was effectively over before it had truly begun, as the political leverage of the United States evaporated alongside Patton's reputation in the snows of Belgium. The map of post-war Europe was being rewritten not in the conference rooms of Yalta, but in the frozen foxholes where American strength was being systematically ground into the mud. Inside the Führer bunker, the news of Bastogne's fall acted like a shot of adrenaline to a dying man, as Adolf Hitler emerged from his stupor to demand even more impossible feats from his exhausted soldiers. He believed that the miracle had finally arrived, and he ordered the jet fighter programs and the V-2 rocket production to be tripled, convinced that he could now force a separate peace with the demoralized West. This false hope led to a prolongation of the war's agony, as the German people were told that the decadent democracies were on the verge of total collapse, leading to a fanatical resistance that would claim hundreds of thousands more lives in the months to come. The shadow of the Third Reich, which had seemed to be retreating, suddenly loomed large once more, casting a dark pall over the liberated zones of France and Belgium. The human cost of this strategic failure was measured in the silence of the Belgian forests, where the spring thaw would eventually reveal a landscape of absolute horror. Thousands of American soldiers, cut off and forgotten in the chaos of the retreat, had fought to the last bullet in isolated farmsteads, their sacrifices rendered meaningless by the larger collapse of the front. The Malmedy massacre was no longer an isolated incident, but a harbinger of a more brutal, no-quarter war that erupted as the Americans sought vengeance for their defeat. The rules of engagement were discarded in favor of a savage, primitive conflict, where the only goal was the total eradication of the enemy who had dared to humiliate the pride of the United States. Just like that, George Patton's world became a prison of his own making, as he was relegated to a secondary theater, his ivory-handled revolvers now a mocking reminder of a glory that had vanished in the mist. He wrote in his diary with a pen dipped in gall, accusing his superiors of cowardice and his peers of incompetence, his ego unable to process the fact that he had been outmaneuvered by the very Krauts he claimed to despise. The old blood and guts was now just an old man watching the war pass him by, his aggressive spirit viewed not as an asset, but as a dangerous liability that had almost cost the Allies the war. This personal downfall of a legend was the most visceral consequence of the failure at Bastogne, a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions played out against the backdrop of global conflagration. As 1945 dawned, the Western Allies were forced to adopt a broad front strategy that was agonizingly slow and industrial in its slaughter, as they no longer had the confidence to attempt the daring armored thrust that Patton had championed. The war of attrition became the new normal, with massive artillery barrages and carpet bombing campaigns replacing tactical finesse, leading to the total pulverization of German cities and the deaths of countless civilians. The weight of history shifted toward a more destructive, less noble conclusion to the conflict, as the bitterness of the Ardennes defeat poisoned the well of Allied mercy. The liberation was no longer a crusade. It was a mechanical, grinding execution of a wounded beast. The political fallout in Washington was immediate and severe, as the Bastogne massacre became a rallying cry for those who questioned the wisdom of the Europe First policy. The American public, shocked by the sudden reversal of fortune, demanded answers for why their sons were being slaughtered in a war that they had been told was almost over. This pressure forced the Roosevelt administration to prioritize results over diplomacy, leading to a harder line against both the Germans and the Soviets, further complicating the fragile peace that was being negotiated for the post-war world. The seas of the Cold War were being watered by the blood of the men who fell in the Ardennes, as trust between the superpowers eroded under the strain of the military crisis. Immediately, the technical superiority of the German defensive weapons began to take a heavier toll, as the stalled Allied advance allowed the Wehrmacht to deploy the Me-262 jets and the heavy Jagdgewehr tank destroyers in numbers that began to challenge Allied air and ground dominance. Each mile of progress toward the Rhine was now bought with a mountain of American and British corpses, as the Ardennes Gap had given the German war industry a vital 3-month window to produce their Wunderwaffen. The sky, once owned by the P-51 Mustangs, was now a deadly arena where the roar jet engines signaled a new and terrifying era of warfare that the Allies were ill-prepared to face. But the most enduring consequence was the loss of the American century's innocence, as the realization hit that even the most powerful nation on earth could be humbled by a desperate and determined foe. The swagger of the GIs who had landed on D-Day was replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of the 1,000-yard stroll, a generation of men who had seen the abyss and realized that victory was not a birthright, but a brutal, ugly transaction. The landscape of the Ardennes remained a scarred and haunted place, a constant reminder that the margin between triumph and catastrophe was as thin as the ice on a Belgian stream. Just like that, the final push into Germany became a somber, joyless march through a wasteland of ruins and bitterness, as the Americans finally crossed the Rhine, not as liberators, but as conquerors who had lost their patience for the enemy. The fall of Berlin to the Red Army, while the Western Allies were still struggling to clear the Ruhr pocket, was the ultimate price paid for the failure at Bastogne. The Iron Curtain was already descending, its path determined by the jagged lines of the German counteroffensive that had broken the back of the American advance in the winter of 1944. In the end, the story of Patton's failure at Bastogne is a cautionary tale of how the ego of a single leader can collide with the reality of war to change the course of human history. It reminds us that victory is never guaranteed, and that the shadows of defeat are always lengthening, even in the moments of our greatest confidence. As we look back at the frozen fields of the Ardennes, we see not just the ghosts of the soldiers who died there, but the what-ifs that continue to haunt the narrative of the Second World War. The war eventually ended, but the world that emerged from the smoke was a darker, more divided place than the one the Allies had envisioned in the summer of 1944. The failure at Bastogne was the fire that forged a new and more dangerous reality, proving that in the house of war there are many rooms, and the most terrifying of all is the one where the heroes fail. As the snow finally melted away, it revealed a world that had been changed forever by the silence of a single crossroads and the pride of a general who promised too much. If you were in Eisenhower's shoes and Patton's relief effort failed, would you have ordered a desperate suicide mission to save the 101st Airborne? Or would you have sacrificed them to save the rest of the Western Front? Let me know your tactical verdict in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.